Wolfram Alderson, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Joan Ifland today. First, I'll just say briefly a little bit about myself, that I'm a lifetime social change agent and very active in what I call the metabolic health and nutrition space, which includes a bunch of folks and leaders and institutions that are prominent in the field. And naturally, I came across Dr. Ifland. As a teenager, I was a leader in the movement to establish the first certified farmers markets in California, and I developed a passion very early in my 4 decades long career for food system change. And so when I come across somebody like Dr. Ifland, I get pretty excited because obviously processed food is such a big part of the problem, and you offer such an important part of the solution. So you're, by way of introduction, the principal author of Processed Food Addiction Foundation's Assessment and Recovery, CEO of Food Addiction Training, and you host a website, foodaddictionreset.com. You hold a BA in economics and political science from Oberlin College, and an MBA from Stanford University, and a PhD specializing in addictive nutrition from the Union Institute and University. And as I understand it, only a couple of those PhDs are out there in the world, so we're blessed to have you specializing in this area. You have made an exceptional effort to study and specialize in the field of processed food addiction, so please share with us a little bit about your background and why you chose to focus on processed food addiction. And part two is, is this personal as well as professional?
Well, Wolfram, I am so delighted to be here with you. You are a longtime warrior in the field, and you are a change agent, and it is really my honor to get to work with you. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes, I say I was born a food addict. I wasn't even aware of the condition until I was 44 years old, but I started to, quote unquote, get sober from processed foods at that age, and never looked back. So what really caught me about what happened when I started to give up processed foods was the change in my personality. I went from a pretty grumpy bear to a much nicer person. Now, a lot of other things happened, but that was the piece that really got my attention and propelled me forward in this career. And yes, I have an undergraduate degree in economics and political science, which is very useful for understanding processed food addiction. That MBA from Stanford is also very useful. This is an industrial-related epidemic. And then the PhD, when I just got to work with the most incredible people in the field, including my co-editors, Marianne Marcus and Harry Pruce, I have been blessed with being able to pursue this right down to the research, and having years and years and years available to me to look at what the research is saying and to create a picture for a syndrome that is very well grounded in science. Yeah, very lucky.
Well, this may sound like an obvious question, but I think it should be asked, what is processed food? I mean, I think the origins of processed food actually had good intentions, if you will.
Sure.
Feeding the military during World War II, and making at least at that time housewives' jobs, lives easier, etc. Better living. So I'm sure this idea of processed food started off with the best of intentions, but
sure,
it's taken us down. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, I think you can look all the way back to Greek times when they began to keep bees. And then honey is a processed food, it's processed by bees. But it's a concentrated substance. And they mixed honey with wine, which is also a processed food. It's extracted from fruits, and you have your first epidemic of diabetes. So people like that so well. It would have addictive properties, and then you have your first epidemic of diabetes. So a processed food is any kind of a substance that has been extracted and concentrated from a plant. So plants have natural endorphins, and that's fine. You eat them, you enjoy your food, but you don't become compulsive about it. Now that's as opposed to a processed food where that endorphin has been extracted and concentrated, and now it's capable of kicking up the reward pathways or addictive pathways, dopamine, serotonin, endorphin, opiate, endocannabinoid, and then you begin to see the brain alterations. So that ultimately is kind of the acid test. Are there brain alterations that look like those of a drug or alcohol addict? And we see that. We see that with processed foods.
And of course, there's foods like yogurt, for example, where on the one hand, you might have a healthy substance that's just cultured milk, fermented milk product. And then on the other hand, it's been adulterated with high fructose corn syrup and additives and fillers and stabilizers, etc.
Yeah.
So there are some foods which have been processed minimally, which are perhaps still healthy, while the same type of food could be very harmful in effect, just because of how it was processed or to what extent it was processed. Correct?
Yes, so what you're saying is you can take a healthy food and if you add sugar to it, which is quite addictive and harmful, then you have altered that food. But dairy is a special case. It is, even raw dairy is made of sugar and fat and cow hormones and actually contains 4 different casomorphines. It is a substance designed to put a 100-pound baby calf to sleep. So it's a mood-altering substance. And that's a good example of how something might not be processed, but have mood-altering properties. And so dairy for us is included in our definition of processed foods.
And as I understand it, there's actually recently been a scientific definition offered of processed food, the NOVA food classification system. The Professor Carlos Monteiro in Brazil has presented that. So that presents like 4 levels of processed food, ultra processed food being the worst, and then minimally or no processing at all being the lowest of impact.
Right. It's a little bit tricky because, for example, high sugar fruits are not processed. However, for a food addict that has a very sensitized sense of taste and a very reactive addictive pathway, a very reactive addicted brain, a high sugar fruit can be addictive. So you have kind of 2 things going on. Is it addictive, which even raw milk, high sugar fruits can be, and nuts can be very addictive for food addicts. And then the question of, is it processed? And processed foods are addictive. And then there's some other categories of foods that are not processed, but which are addictive.
Well, of course, your book on the shelf behind you provides a lot of answers to these questions, and it's amazing how complex the issue of processed food is. You have created a program, though, to help folks with processed food addiction return to health called foodaddictionreset.com is the name of the website. But I would appreciate it if you would just describe the human level experience of processed food addiction, what that looks like to an individual as opposed to the academic perspective, and to share some of the challenges, symptoms, or health conditions that are associated with the disease processed food addiction.
Well, that's a very good question. I believe, based on my reading of research, that food addiction is the driver of diet-related diseases. So the globe is now really, it's a global epidemic. It's a pandemic of diet-related diseases. We see statistics such as 80% of healthcare costs in the United States are for diet-related diseases. It has surpassed tobacco as the most preventable disease, diet-related diseases. So the consequences are severe. It can be things that most people would associate with diet, such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease. And then increasingly people are recognizing cancer. People are recognizing mood disorders, depression, and even mental disorders such as Alzheimer's and dementia. So we do see a very broad range of consequences. How would you know, how would somebody know that they have food addiction? Well, it turns out that overeating, chronic overeating, meets very, very extensively the DSM-5 substance use disorder diagnostic criteria. So things like a failure to cut back, unintended use.
The non-technical listeners, the DSM-5 is essentially the diagnostic manual that psychologists or psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health conditions.
Right. So thank you, Wolfram. Substance use disorders is what they call drug and alcohol addiction. It involves a substance. And processed food addiction involves substances, processed foods. And it just meets those criteria very, very closely. Unintended use, failure to cut back, lots of time spent getting and recovering from use. And then things like a withdrawal syndrome. People get headaches and stomach aches and fatigue when they withdraw from processed foods, and use in spite of knowledge of consequences. So yeah, that's how you would know. However, there is an easier way. I see in the statistics that so much processed food disappears into our culture, and it's so easy. This is an easy addiction to get. The research shows that you only need 7 days of a rat ingesting a 30% sugar solution before that rat's brain starts to show the addictive adaptation. So it's a very easy addiction to get, and I think most people have maybe at least a little bit, and then all the way up to very severe cases.
Well, as a CEO of the Hypoglycemia Support Foundation, and obviously passionate about the subject of low blood sugar and blood sugar dysregulation, I think most people, when I talk to folks in a room, will, if I ask how many of you experience the blood sugar roller coaster, the ups and downs during the day, almost 3/4 of the room at least will raise their hand. And everybody seems to know what hangry means.
Yes.
And notice that there's a significant change in mood and affect related to low blood sugar or that blood sugar roller coaster effect. And so, I think this is really an issue affecting the majority of the population. And we see these little symptoms, which we maybe would have taken more seriously a few decades ago, but it's become a daily part of our existence. You have low blood sugar, so what do? You drink a Coke, you have a latte, you eat some carbs, you just feed that addiction versus confronting it. And is it possible to even get off that blood sugar roller coaster?
Yes, it is. We have recovery protocols. The last third of the textbook is on recovery. And I think this is the most important thing for people to know, is that when you apply classic addiction recovery methods, abstinence and support, people just blossom. They come out of it, the cravings stop, they get mental clarity, they begin to understand what to do for themselves, especially if they're in a support community. And they do great. They do great.
Well, when you read your book, if folks is available on Amazon.com, it's a heavy document. I think between 400 and 500 pages, a very thorough review of the literature. And reading it, you might assume that food addiction is just should be mainstream or accepted, but it seems that food addiction, and in particular processed food addiction, is still a controversial subject. So I'd appreciate if you could just, again, for the less technical folks in the audience, lay out a few of the key perspectives on food addiction that are out there, the basic frames that the medical field and addiction professionals have about it. and how the processed food addiction correlates to other areas of addiction, which I think you do so well in your book, and why this field is so controversial. And I have a few more questions, but I'll let you answer those first three. So the key perspectives on food addiction, how the field correlates to other areas of addiction, and why the field is controversial.
Okay, good. All good questions. Let's start with some basic concepts. People wonder how such an obvious addiction, because once you understand what's going on with it, it's really obvious. You can see people engaged in the addiction commonly out in public, and of course our loved ones at home. I think the place to start is with the late 1980s, when the tobacco industry took over the processed food industry. And they had a marketing and business model. It had what I call the 5 A's of an epidemic of an addiction. And it's lots and lots of advertising. It's very easy availability. It's affordability. So you have the same marketing pieces, and you have a lot of vending machines. Like sodas are very, very cheap. Cigarettes, when they started becoming an epidemic, were very cheap. You have tons and tons of advertising, billboards and television advertising, magazine advertising, and now, of course, online advertising. And then the 4th A is a young age of onset. So with cigarettes, you had the Joe Cool campaign where they were advertising to 10-year-old boys. And with processed foods, you have advertising to infants. Basically, infant formula is often sugary. And then the 5th A is addictive properties in the product. So we know that cigarettes were enhanced to be addictive. We see that in the research. And we know that processed foods are very highly manipulated with the help of neuroscientists and brain imaging technology to very specifically activate those craving pathways and then move the braking system in the frontal lobe, move that offline. I think that's the place to start. And I like starting there because it explains why so many people could have gotten so obese in such a short period of time, 20 years. It's an effective business model. And the tobacco executives were very experienced at applying it, the addictive business model, and they just moved those concepts over to processed foods. So I think that, and I also think that helps people understand their own behavior. If this is not your fault, yes, once you know what to do about it, you can work on it, but you didn't ask for this. You know, it's some piece of it is your childhood issues, but not all of it. Some of it is just from the environment, from living in this brutal, very aggressive environment. Okay, so what do you do? You start with awareness. You just really focus on your environment. Where are you being exposed to processed foods? Where is your brain receiving food stimulation, like grocery stores and restaurants and even the highway? And you just start with awareness. We have found the most important thing, I think, coming out of the processed food addiction book is that this is a very severe addiction. This is not garden variety alcoholism. This has a lot of different substances. It starts very young. The triggering and the stimulation from the environment is very intense. And so what I have found over the years is that processed food addicts do really well with a higher level of support. Now, what does that mean? Well, in our food addiction reset community, we offer 3 hours a day of online support. So a video chat, like Wolfram and I are having right now, 2 hours a day of that, and then a third hour of a conference call. you can begin to think that this is starting to look a little bit like an intensive outpatient program, but online and spread out through the day. That turns out to be the level of support that food addicts benefit from, and it's working. So we do have a really good solution.
But we are faced with, you know, a medical situation where we often hear everything in moderation. We often hear, you know, calories in, calories out. It doesn't matter what calories, it's just a matter of the energy balance. And whether you have calories from Coca-Cola or sugar or cookies or from almonds and lettuce, it's all about the calories. And it's just, you know, like I said, everything in moderation. That's something we commonly hear. It's kind of shocking that less than 30% of doctors even take a nutrition course in medical school. So we are faced with this terrible problem that when we do go to our doctors and health practitioners, there's often very little awareness of nutrition science in general, let alone processed food addiction.
Yes. So you're hitting on another very good point about the seriousness of this particular addiction. Addictions in general are hard to treat. It's generally because the program is not big enough. It has to be bigger than the addiction. So you have to be stimulating recovery thoughts in the client more than the addiction is stimulating cravings. So it's a big job, and it needs to be done over a long period of time. We know what we're doing. We're reprogramming neurons to stop craving and to start being very positive and proactive in a life. But this particular addiction is disguised. The food industry has done a tremendous job of presenting these particular addictive substances as if they were food. Now, contrast that to cigarettes. Nobody was ever confused about what they were doing. They were smoking a cigarette. Nobody ever confused smoke with clean air. But people confuse, very high-end chocolate, for example, with food. Very high-end chocolate is a drug. I'm sorry to say that. I know that's not going to make everybody really happy. But it acts on the body like a drug. The body recognizes it as a drug, but people have it classed over here with a food. So that is a source of grave confusion. It takes a long time to sort that out. We do have very good, clear, simple handouts at a website called Food Addiction Resources. And there's one sheet that says excluded foods and another sheet that says unprocessed foods. And that's very easy to follow. And people, you could just give them a lot of time to get used to these ideas and to figure out how they're going to work it into their lives. And you can get a lot of progress just from that, especially if they're in a support community. Now, the other thing that has so confused this issue is this fact that one of the consequences of processed food addiction is the collection of fat tissue on the human body. It's called adipose tissue. So people have just been riveted by this fat tissue, this fat tissue, this fat tissue, and they have missed the addiction. The problem is here with these hyperactive craving pathways, hypoactive executive function, hyperactive stress pathways, a classic addicted brain. So this makes my job of education much more difficult. We're having to undo firmly held long-term beliefs about what to do about overeating. And once you just get onto that addiction model, okay, this is a kind of alcoholism. Just think of sugar as crystallized alcohol. Then you have a chance. Oh, I know what to do with that. You get the guy or the gal off the substance, and you give them a lot of support for rebuilding their lives. Yeah, then it works great.
you brought up a really important point about the focus on obesity and adipose tissue. Our colleague, Dr. Robert Lustig, has presented often in his presentations a chart showing the inclusive view of metabolic disease, which in essence shows that while yes, 80% of those who are overweight do suffer from some metabolic conditions, but 40% of those who are non-obese, the skinny, if you will, suffer from metabolic disease. And that number is actually greater than those who are overweight and suffer from metabolic disease. So
Right.
we're talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, and many other conditions, loss of eyesight, many medical conditions which do not manifest as fat tissue. In a sense, like people like me, I look at a carbohydrate and it seems like I gain weight, but I have eliminated all the symptoms in my life of being pre-diabetic or being on the blood sugar roller coaster and all of those health issues. So it's possible to be healthy and obese, and it's possible to be sick and skinny.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm so grateful to Robert Lustig for that concept. He calls it TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and that's just enormously helpful. Trying to get people's attention off the fat tissue and onto brain function is 98% of the game. Yeah.
Well, of course, your book does provide a lot of guidance for medical practitioners. That's one of the points of the book, not only to provide a literature review, but to help them actually provide guidance in their practice and helping to treat the condition. What are some of the criterion used to diagnose processed food addiction? You know, when you're, and again, for the everyday person, you did mention the 5 A's, but just some of the things that we might look at in our lives that might say, oh, that's a red flag. Maybe this is an issue I should pay some attention to. I've noticed that A, B, C, and D. What would be those certainly you talk to people every day online, and there are those obvious ones who are overweight. But so that's a clear indication. Maybe something's out of order, but there are many others. What would some of those other criterion be?
You know, I've noticed something very interesting. Say in the last year, we have a big group on Facebook, Food Addiction Education. People look at me sideways sometimes when I say, you hang out on Facebook? I said, well, I go where the food addicts are, and they're on Facebook. So what I have seen recently is that people want to stop the behavior around food. So when they come in, maybe 1 in 10 will mention wanting to lose weight, but everybody is saying they want to get control over their food. So loss of control. What does loss of control look like? So it could be, I want to stop, but I can't. I wake up in the morning, I have a plan that I'm not going to eat XYZ today, and I do by 10 o'clock. Or I have tried to stop and I can stop for a day, but then it comes back. So that's failure to stop and its unintended use. The third big one is cravings. And that is just, I think about food when I don't really want to be thinking about food. So the obsession. And then there's time spent. So you used to be able to drive home, but now you have to stop somewhere along the way. Or you used to be able to get through the afternoon, but now you go to the vending machine and you're just spending more time. You get home and you're too tired. You used to be able to play with your kids in the evening, but now you're too tired. So those are all indications. Now those are all having to do with the person. In the next stage of development of the addiction, it spreads out to other people. So you see things like an inability to fulfill roles. Like, I would like to be able to go to school, but I can't think clearly enough. I'm too tired to go to school. Or I would like to be able to play with my children, and as a mother, I'm just too tired and brain fogged. So failure to fulfill roles. And then you get into the consequences. hazardous use. So you're driving down the road, you've been through a fast food place, you've got your drink is in the cup, and you've got your sandwich, and you've got your French fries, you're digging around the French fries, and you're driving with your elbow. That's hazardous use. Like, you cannot wait to get to a safe spot to eat that. The compulsion is so great. Yeah, so hazardous use. The withdrawal syndrome, if I stop using, I get very anxious, or I get a headache, and so I will eat something to calm the anxiety or to calm the headache, or the cravings are just so intense. Those are withdrawal symptoms. And what's happening in there is that you're preventing withdrawal. So withdrawal and then use in spite of consequences. Like, my doctor told me not to eat that and I'm eating it. That's a dead giveaway that it's gone beyond your control. And then tolerance, where you start out getting that cup of coffee in the morning, and then at some point you want a cup of coffee in the afternoon. And then you want another cup of coffee in late morning. That's tolerance. You're just using more and more. So maybe you used to get donuts once a week, and now you're getting donuts twice a week. You used to get one donut, now you're getting 2 donuts. You used to get this size cookies, and now you're getting that size cookies. That's tolerance. And yes, that's another big indicator. Yeah.
Well, one component of your program is the concept of abstinence. And when I think of abstinence, I think of the famous, presidential campaign, Just Say No.
Yeah.
And I'm sure your program is much more than just say no. But why abstinence? So why not everything in moderation? Why not say, oh, just a little bit? Explain why this is an important part of your program.
Well, an addiction, what you're doing in an addiction is you're quieting the lower level addictive pathways, the reward pathways. These are reflexive pathways. In other words, they don't go through a thinking process. You have the craving, your frontal lobe goes offline, you're eating. So you want to stop stimulating those pathways. You want those to become very, very quiet. And so if you take a bite of something, you wake them up. And then they start chattering, and they're just like, oh, feed me some more, I'll get that one while you're, loss of control. So when you are an alcoholic, for example, and you want to quit drinking, you have to get abstinent. And there are many arguments about this, whether you could go to reduced harm, or at least the person's not drinking and driving. That's a treatment success, but is that person optimum? I don't know. We talk about this in our recovery circles, and people say all the time, once you get over to the other side and you've gotten the stuff out of your system, they say, oh, this is much easier. Being abstinent is much easier than using sometimes, than eating some of this stuff sometimes. Because if I open that door to sometime, then my brain is going to be thinking about when is that sometime all the time. So it's going to be, oh, I'm going there, when am I going to have something, what I'm going to have, how much of it I'm going to have, who's going to see me eat it, and how am I going to feel afterwards. And no, but if you're abstinent, and if you're in a group that's abstinent, that's the key. To be around other people who are doing this, because we do things in tribes. We do things in groups. We are social people. We're social creatures. Then you just relax. You say, oh, no, well, I don't eat that. I can go anywhere, and I'm not going to eat that. So I think I'll think about the people who are going to be there. Think about how much fun it will be to see those people. I'll think about the beautiful setting. But you're not in that obsession of how much am I going to eat and how much who's going to see me, and then I'm going to take 2, I'm going to take 1, and I'll just have 1 bite, and then oh gosh, if I lose control, I'll just leave. And that's that very obsessive, compulsive, craving thinking. You really want that to go away.
Well, I think another aspect that people might associate with abstinence is doing without, but really when you're talking about real food, wholesome food, You're talking about abundance, not an
Oh,
absence.
yeah.
Abstinence doesn't mean absence.
Right.
It can mean an abundance of healthy, whole, real food that's nourishing and satisfying, that makes you feel satiated. Shopping for real food at the farmer's market. I mean,
Beautiful.
shopping to prepare meals from real food can be rewarding. I spend more time today than I've ever spent, shopping for food and preparing food, but that's all, time for my health and well-being, as opposed to buying foods that have been prepared and processed and so on. So I think that's often, sometimes we associate that idea of abstinence with doing without, but it's actually doing with.
Well, that's another reason to be in a really good group, a good group that's identifying the full range of benefits. So a lot of groups might not identify, for example, release from brain fog, or energy, or patience, or calm thinking, or being able to read because you have a bit of an attention span back, making decisions, memory, restraint, financial security, because the diseases related to processed food are very expensive, and the processed food itself is expensive. But I do want to mention that we have a video on Amazon called Victory Over Food Addiction. It does show people how to make all their food for the week in 2 hours. So especially if you use an online ordering system, which maybe it'll take 15 minutes, you can establish a list. You can go back to that list every week. I found that when I put my family on this 22 years ago, we ate the same food list, but I just made it up into a whole bunch of different meals. And I did all my cooking. I put all the proteins in the oven or on the top of the stove, all the starches, in a few hours over the weekend. Froze some of it, put the rest in the back of the refrigerator where it's cold. And then all week long, we had 5-minute meals. I would pull out enough for dinner and lunch the next day, put the dinner on the plates, put the lunches in the lunch containers. It was very easy. And people say that to me all the time. The food is not the problem. I understand how to make the food. I have time to make the food. I'm making the food. It's the people around me who are the problem. People complaining that I don't eat what they want. They want me to eat what they want. So we do a lot of training in the Addiction Reset community on how to manage people, how to manage all the food stimulation in our environment. And it's one of the reasons why we see so much success in there.